These 6 friends spurned the traditions of their continent, instead following one of music history's wildest eccentrics, crafting a body of work that is unified in its extra-musical goals, but extraordinarily diverse between any 2 of the 6. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Les Six. To understand the origins of Les Six, we must first visit where their name came from, the Five, or the Mighty Handful. These Russian composers from the prior century to Les Six emerged as a band of drinking buddies under the autocratic auspices of Milhaud, whose singular goal was the eradication of a nascent academicization of Russian music. In contrast, the 6 that became Les Six, so called in direct comparison and contrast to the Five, weren't fighting against academicization because the French conservatory system had long since been established. They also had no Balakirevian figure, no first among equals, no leader figure. The most you could say is that their leader figures were not even members of the group. Les Six also worked collaboratively on 2 projects, whereas the Mighty Handful tried to collaborate on 1 project and that fell through. Unlike the Mighty Handful, Les Six were not followers of one particular group or style. Individual voices within Les Six were far more disparate from one another than the overall nationalistic thrust and impulse of the Mighty Handful, and this is where the comparison between these 2 groups of composers falls totally apart. There are many stylistic variations and fault lines within Les Six, where some would fall on one side and some would fall on the other. So making broad statements about the group becomes really tricky. I can't even say that they all love the music of Erik Satie, but 5 of them did, so it's fair to see the supermajority as the group's approval of Satie's whimsical and proto-Dadaist aesthetics. I might overuse the word broadly here, and that's because I don't want to give anyone the mistaken impression that Les Six was some kind of ideologically coherent school. Les Six never had this. They always positioned themselves as merely a group of friends. The diversity of style within the group was entirely the point. They all branched off from the same handful of points of departure. What they agreed on was creating an identifiably French sound and style. Identifiably French not just to French people, but to anyone all across the world. So what did these friends actually organize around? Well, there are a couple of big movers and shakers in this world, and we would be remiss if we focused exclusively on just these 6 composers. Many in their circle influenced them. There were aesthetic pioneers, spokesmen, and thought leaders, such as the aforementioned Erik Satie and the creative jack-of-all-trades Jean Cocteau, who came the closest to proposing a group ideology. But this is tricky because Les Six was more in agreement as to what they were against than what they were for, and they really couldn't even agree on what exactly they were against either. In order to get a big picture of this, we have to take a step back and think about French culture as a whole, and specifically French composers over the years who tried in different ways to make their music sound identifiably French by making it sound not German. They actually had a great deal of success in this department, dating back to the French operas of Jean-Baptiste Lully, which was a manifestation of this, as were the French organists who played French-built organs, as were the Impressionists. Claude Debussy and Maurice Ravel both hated the term Impressionist as inadequate and inappropriate, although it served as shorthand to refer to music characterized by lush textures, impeccable orchestration, extended, often non-functional harmonies, and a broad disinterest in melody, especially in Debussy's case. Aesthetically, they were similar to symbolist writers like Maurice Maeterlinck and Stéphane Mallarmé, who elevated the sonic qualities of words higher than their actual meaning, leaving a lot of symbolist poetry functionally untranslatable. While a third of the group professed a fondness for Ravel and Debussy, Debussy was more of a target. His Impressionism, as many saw it, was cribbed from the Russian nationalism of Mighty Handful member Modeste Mussorgsky. Debussy was not writing French music because, to their ears, Impressionism was Debussy's synthesis of something that was distinctly not French. Yet when it came to opinions on German music, and of Richard Wagner in particular, Debussy and Les Six would be in lockstep. Thus, Les Six represents a group of composers that rejected Wagnerian bombast as much as they rejected Debussy's rejection of that bombast. Now, you could take this aesthetic position at that time pretty easily by saying, well, I agree with the professors in the conservatory. They openly were hostile to a lot of Impressionism, and they were openly hostile to the overt Germanic style of Wagner. Lesseps went one rejection further, because they saw the conservatory system, and specifically the French organ school of composers like César Franck, as simply being too Germanic, too Wagnerian. The conservatory culture also had much to do with ivory tower refinement, while Lesseps wanted to return to simplicity as influenced by popular forms and idioms. The music hall styles were not popular in the Conservatoire's halls. This is why they were broadly on the same page as Satie, whose whimsical style anticipated post-World War I sentiments in art. Satie is often associated with the Dada movement, which emerged towards the end of his life. And for the Dadaists, art was almost like a reward for a good world, and the world was just so messed up that the world deserved a kind of negation of art, a kind of anti-art. Satie's music fit the bill. It was odd, whimsical, didn't take itself too seriously, and was deeply entrenched in the cabaret world where he had to eke out a living. Satie's pieces didn't start someplace and build to a climax. They just existed, more similar to visual art than anything else. To supporters, this approach evokes something of France and Frenchness that Lesseps latched onto. Insofar as Lesseps could be said to have any sort of ideology, it was a broad agreement that French music should remain identifiably French, specifically through an engagement with middle or lowbrow forms of art. They were interested in directness and accessibility, and not necessarily following the tradition. This is why, paradoxically, they were quite big fans of Igor Stravinsky and Arnold Schoenberg, for the groundbreaking ways in which these two composers upended musical tradition. Okay, so enough about the general trends and styles. Let's talk about specific names and dates. Arranged roughly in order of importance, the composers within Lesseps were Francis Poulenc, Darius Milhaud, Arthur Honegger, Germaine Tailleferre, Georges Auric, and Louis Duret. And once again, I would like to make a note that I do not speak French. Cocteau considered himself the leader of this group and its honorary 7th member, although he had no musical aptitude. He could play a little bit by ear, but only in F major for some reason. Of this group, there were vast differences in their styles. Poulenc, Tailleferre, and Duret were more stereotypically French in their sound and style, whereas Milhaud explored polytonality pretty extensively, and he also was a fan of Brazilian folk music and jazz and basically any style from around the world, synthesized into his polytonal language. Then you had Auric, who did a bunch of film score work, and you had Honegger, who was the most Germanic of the bunch due to his Swiss heritage. Auric, Honegger, and Milhaud were all inspired by jazz to one extent or another, whereas the other three were anything ranging from apathetic to fearful of it. Poulenc said that he liked it, but he only listened to it in the bath. Honegger, Milhaud, and Tailleferre wrote for a Swedish ballet company, whereas Auric and Poulenc wrote for the prestigious Ballet Russe. And then you had Duret, who didn't even write any ballets at all. He was fearful of large forms and those kinds of dramatic inclinations, which is odd considering that ballet's resurgence in the 1920s was fueled by Parisian anti-Wagnerian sentiments. Auric, Duret, and Poulenc refused to take on students, whereas Honegger, Tailleferre, and especially Milhaud did. Duret, Tailleferre, and Poulenc liked Debussy and Ravel, whereas the other three didn't. Honegger liked Beethoven, and he couldn't stand Satie, where it was the exact opposite for everyone else. This is the paradox of Lesseps. Their music is similar enough to work together in compilation pieces, but once you start drilling down into their philosophies and who they liked and who they didn't like and the ways in which their careers went after the era of Lesseps, you find they're 6 completely different composers. This drilling down reveals more differences than similarities, differences that would jeopardize the coherence of a group if it had a coherent ideology. Tailleferre was the first of the group to enroll at the Petit Conservatoire against her father's wishes in 1906 when she was 14. Milhaud, Auric, and Honegger joined her there in 1913, and Milhaud's apartment became a group hangout spot outside of class. Poulenc was an acquaintance of Milhaud starting in 1915 when they randomly played tennis against one another at the house of a mutual friend, and Poulenc asked Milhaud for his autograph. Poulenc's family prevented him from his desired musical study at the Conservatoire. World War I scattered the group. For a while, Milhaud, Honegger, and Tailleferre were able to continue their studies in a limited capacity at the Conservatoire, but the bombardment of Paris meant that that too had to go. Louis Duret had to pursue independent private study, not at the Scala Cantorum, which was the other big conservatory in Paris, but private study with a professor at the Scala Cantorum, someone who taught there and also taught him outside of the auspices of the school. That's often a misconception. The war also sent Milhaud all the way to Brazil. By 1916, it seems like all of the members of the group met one another to one extent or another. Figuring out exactly when everyone finally met up is a little bit tricky. But in 1917, Tailleferre met Satie. He heard one of her pieces and immediately christened her his musical daughter. 5 of the 6 found something to appreciate in Satie, with Poulenc, Auric, and Milhaud lining up more on the pro-Satie side, whereas Duret, Tailleferre, and Honegger especially lining up as anti-Satie, or at least questioning of his theories. Poulenc and Milhaud's other activities during the war precluded them from being a part of Satie's circle any earlier than they were. And Satie's circle of young composers who were aligned with his aesthetics was something that Satie called the New Youths. He considered himself a youth even though he wasn't young. This was a direct reference to the Ravelite youths of the previous generation, which had congregated around the aesthetics of Ravel. But it wasn't just Satie. Jean Cocteau and Pablo Picasso counted among the non-musical artists who exemplified a glorification of the mundane, with Cocteau explicitly on the side of Les Six. In 1918, Cocteau penned a short volume called Le Coq et l'Harlequin, or The Rooster and the Harlequin, which lambasted not only German music, but justified dislike for Debussy's Impressionism by linking it with Mussorgsky. Cocteau's interest in clarity meant that he agreed with Debussy that French music needed to move beyond the pull of Wagner, but he disagreed with Debussy on the method of doing so. Cocteau put it succinctly when he said that he wanted music that had borders, like a house he could live in. So this vague, melodyless impressionism was out, and hard percussive edges were in. This doesn't mean that you can't find impressionist tendencies within Les Six. As mentioned, 3 out of the 6 actually didn't mind the impressionists that much. Tailleferre was especially on friendly terms with Ravel. They would go on hikes around his estate, and he would always try to support her career. And you can hear that influence in a lot of her pieces. I mean, keep in mind that Ravel once said that all of his students, save Raphael Williams, wrote music that just sounded like him. Cocteau was additionally against the huge scale of German music, which he traced from Beethoven all the way through to the evening-length productions of Wagner. And he said that fans of these composers mistook their length for quality. So he encouraged French organizations to not program not just Wagner, but not program Beethoven either. He encouraged French composers to keep it short, write short pieces with an emphasis on melody, something he felt the Impressionists had obscured. Cocteau saw this as less of a revolution and more of a return to what had been lost, leading Poulenc to characterize Cocteau as a poet and chronicler of the group, not their theoretician. And while not a musician, save for his occasional stints as an amateur jazz drummer, Cocteau saw himself in the role of Les Six's impresario, securing roles for them, collaborating with them, supplying texts to them, that sort of thing. Poulenc, on the other hand, believed that this tract was not actually Les Six's manifesto, despite Cocteau's role as their spokesman, and he specifically cited the Germanically influenced Honegger as the reason that couldn't possibly be the case. Instead, he saw this tract as a defense of Satie's aesthetics against those of Igor Stravinsky. If you're getting the sense here that Cocteau was a bit of a go-getter, you would be right. Milhaud's wife Madeleine said that if he wasn't in charge of everything, he didn't feel like he was doing anything, an attitude that made Cocteau butt heads on at least one occasion with Satie. Cocteau's tract, which was dedicated to Auric, was a factor in splitting Satie off from the other members of the New Youths. He told Duret that he didn't want to be considered an official member of the group anymore, although he still had the same relationship to everyone within the group as he had had previously. Although Satie had collaborated with Cocteau and Picasso on his ballet Parade, which used a battery of unconventional percussion instruments and featured groundbreaking designs by Picasso, there was a good deal of tension between them, not the least of which was because Cocteau had inserted sound effects into Parade that obscured the score. Perhaps Satie didn't want the ways in which he and Cocteau differed to fracture a group that they both had a hand in assembling and mentoring. In 1919, the publisher Eugène de Metz capitalized on the association between these 6 composers by commissioning each of them to contribute pieces to a collective piano suite that was eventually entitled L'Album des Six. It would be the only project that the whole group would collaborate on, and it wasn't exactly easy. By accounts, Duret had to convince them to contribute pieces, and several of them didn't even write new stuff for it. By this point, the 6 that would become Les Six had been established. They just weren't established under that name quite yet. But in addition to this canonical 6, there were plenty of other composers in their circle whose pieces were performed on concerts that featured the other members of the group and who were at their parties, who would attend their functions. Members of the group that, because they weren't part of the canonical 6, have since faded away into Les Six Apocrypha. These included Jean Huret, Jean-Roger Ducas, Henri Cliquet-Pleyel, and Alexis Roland Manuel, the latter 2 of whom might have made for 7th members of the group had they not been away from Paris at crucial times. These composers, and many others, although participating in concerts and gatherings within this milieu, were not listed when, in January 1920, the critic Henri Collet published an article that labeled the 6 composers of Les Six as Les Six. Cocteau had pulled strings. He explicitly arranged for this and told Collet in late 1919 that he should do an article on these 6 composers and told him to interview these 6 composers specifically. Another extraneous member was Charles Coquelin, a composer and theorist whose students included Poulenc and Tailleferre. Although not young, he was quite sympathetic to the aesthetic cause of the movement. Collet's article was less of a provocative declaration of a group of 6, but rather a renaming of this group of Satie's new youths that had already existed for several years. This is where the comparison to the Russian 5 comes in, because Collet, he had a political motivation in naming these as nationalist composers, basically just saying, hey, these are French composers, and we need to support them. He lauded Les Six on their willingness to return to simplicity in the various ways that they did so, and their collective album was retitled upon its publication in order to capitalize on the fervor that surrounded this article. So different were its members in temperament that Milhaud found it absurd to group them together. But he realized that if he or anyone else within that group said, hey, I don't think this is a good way to characterize us, that would be working against their own careers. So instead, Milhaud and others leaned into this grouping. Of all the ironies in Les Six, the fact that Les Six only lasted for less than 2 years as 6 composers is the greatest irony of them all. Louis Duret, who had served as a secretary for the new youths and now continued in that secretarial role for Les Six, became disenchanted with how other members of the group were treating his beloved Impressionists. Now, again, he was not the only member of the group to like these composers. Half of them did, but he took it more personally. And he also, as mentioned, didn't like ballet. So when Jean Cocteau, when Auric turned down the full commission, commissioned the entire group to contribute pieces to his new ballet called The Newlyweds in the Eiffel Tower, or The Marriage Party on the Eiffel Tower, Duret quit with 4 days left before the premiere, which meant that Tailleferre, assisted by Milhaud in orchestrating, had to add another piece to this project with less than a week left. This premiere was bumpy and contentious, with a riot, although not as big a riot as in Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, but it was enough that Tailleferre was fearing for her life, and she and her mother had to scamper off to a dressing room to hide from the rioting crowd. The aggressive contingent in the crowd was not entirely due to Cocteau's bizarre scenario for the ballet. It had something to do with that, but the biggest boo-birds in the audience were different factions of the Parisian Dada movement. They all hated one another, but the only thing they could agree on was that they hated Jean Cocteau. So they yelled, "Long live Dada!" from the audience. Certain Les Six members, particularly Auric and to a lesser extent Milhaud, had been affiliated with different factions of the Dada movement, but it wasn't as close an alignment and marriage as you might expect. Duret's withdrawal from the group cited illness, but in reality, He didn't like the direction the group was going, and he also was really uncomfortable with these large dramatic forms. Specifically, he just wasn't a ballet composer. While Duret would show up for reunion concerts and remained friends with the other 5 members, he intentionally distanced himself from all other possible group projects, leaving Les Six with really only 5 members. Honegger professed confusion at this resignation, saying that, in essence, well, I'm far enough away from what this group stands for. Like, I don't even like Satie, so you would think that if there's a reason to quit the group, I would have found it by now and I would have been out of here before Duret was. But Honegger never felt that urge because he understood Les Six as a group of friends. Duret saw it as more of an organized thing than it actually was. Critics who didn't understand this key facet tended to see this group as a promotional strategy for lesser composers banding together for purposes of pursuing fame, or, even worse, pawns of Cocteau. There was no definitive point at which Les Six ceased to be a functional group. Duret would show up for reunion concerts, and it made their name inaccurate, but it didn't split them up. Auric and Poulenc got into a spat with Satie at the end of the elder composer's life, but even when Satie died in 1925, this didn't spell the end of the group because he was never part of the group. He had been a mentor to them, yes, but they had long since emerged out from under his guidance. Milhaud was in charge of taking care of Satie during his final illness, and he, along with Poulenc and Tailleferre, went to Satie's apartment after his death, and there discovered a bunch of manuscripts long thought lost, unopened packages, hordes of umbrellas, and 2 pianos stacked on top of one another. Members of the group would, minus Duret, collaborate with one another, and they would hang out at this local bar called Le Boeuf sur le Toit, named after a Milhaud ballet that was also inspired by a Brazilian folk song. The youth of the group at their inception necessitated their adaptability as time went on. Duret's music went more political. His communist leanings were solidified during the Depression, and he wrote songs on texts by Chairman Mao or Ho Chi Minh. Poulenc and Honegger both wrote sacred music in different ways. Auric did a bunch of film scores, and Tailleferre wrote bigger and bigger pieces, although her career was interrupted by terrible marriages to men who didn't want her to compose, even though she found ways to do that. As for Milhaud, he basically kept on doing what he always did, synthesizing all these different styles together in his unique polytonal language. He was by far the most prolific of Les Six, with over 400 pieces to his name. 3 of the 6 would be reunited on one group project to celebrate Bastille Day in 1936, and then World War II scattered the members of the group once again. The Jewish Milhaud escaped to California, where he taught at Oakland's Mills College, and Tailleferre, stuck in a second miserable marriage, was stuck in a suburb outside of Philadelphia to raise her daughter. Duret was involved in the resistance, as was Poulenc to a much lesser extent, and Honegger in a controversial way. Some have seen his actions as evidence of him being a Nazi collaborator. Auric seemed to be the only one who was relatively unaffected, and we do know that he was involved in the resistance to some extent, but scholarship is unsure of this extent. Honegger, in bad health, died in 1955, and Poulenc followed him unexpectedly 8 years later. The 4 remaining members passed away between 1974 and 1983. With French music having moved on from the movement they so idiosyncratically represented, somewhere in there, Les Six had ceased to be. They left behind a vast body of work, which was appreciated by composers who sought, or merely did not shun, audiences. Composers like Aaron Copland, who appreciated their down-to-earth approach. The members of the group all seemed to have regarded the group as still active until the death of Honegger in 1955, and they delighted in telling different things to the press about the current state of Les Six up until that point. Like my previous coverage of The Mighty Handful, this series is going to be 7 parts. This video followed by 6 videos on each member of Les Six, going in alphabetical order, and ending with a remake of my March 2017 video on Germaine Tailleferre. We'll follow them as expressions of Les Six's identity, the ways in which their paths crossed, and the ways in which their paths diverged over time.